an agreement like this with Alberta has tremendous potential of settling the question over the long term. And actually industry can look at the political reality of it and say, okay, there is, political consensus between the Alberta government and the federal government. There is agreement, and that bodes well for the longevity of these systems.
Canada's industrial carbon pricing system just went through a major political test. The federal government and Alberta struck a deal in May that aimed to fix some long-standing issues in the pricing system, including credits trading at prices well below the target price, and it establishes some new mechanisms like a price floor and carbon contracts for difference. The trade-off is a lower headline price for emissions credits that could lead to 50 to 80 megatons of additional emissions. Depending on who you ask, the deal is either a major unlock, offering more stability and clarity, or a major step backwards, sacrificing ambition and opening the door to renegotiation. To discuss all this, I'm joined today by Etienne Rainville, Vice President for Central Canada at Clean Prosperity, a policy organization that has been one of the most consistent advocates for market-based carbon pricing in Canada. Etienne, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Justin. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really glad we could sit down. I've been looking for an opportunity to chat with you for a while, so what better opportunity than this? So Clean Prosperity has been a consistent and one of the main advocates for carbon pricing and market-based climate policy in Canada. Could you give a bit of background on Clean Prosperity and maybe specifically your work on this MOU negotiations?
Yeah, so Clean Prosperity has been around in slightly different forms for the better part of the last decade. Initially, some of the work was a little more grassroots oriented, and in fact, the name of the organization was Canadians for Clean Prosperity, kind of a tip of the hat towards the grassroots focus of the organization at that time. But where we found ourselves in the last 6 or so odd years has been more in the think tank and advocacy space. So our staffing is kind of split equally between folks who do crunchy policy work and the folks who do government relations and advocacy across many of the key provinces in Canada when it comes to emissions. So Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and the federal government are kind of our key areas of focus. And then the niche that we occupy, there's lots of climate organizations, lots of climate think tanks in Canada. There's a pretty robust ecosystem. And we're on the market-based policies. So what that's meant is historically, the bulk of our work, say 90+% of it, has been focused on carbon markets as kind of the key way to unlock decarbonization and focused on lowest cost decarbonization using those market mechanisms.
How did you personally find your way to this work?
Yeah, so my personal background is in government relations for the better part of the last decade. But I'm originally from Alberta, originally from Fort McMurray, in fact. So the conversation around energy and climate is one that's actually very close to home, doing those summer jobs, working on the oil sand sites.
Yeah.
My father was an engineer with Syncrude for his entire career. So when I came to Ottawa, I had actually initially intended to work in kind of the natural resources and energy conversation. That's actually not where I found myself. I found myself working as a political staffer initially in public safety, national security type issues. But when the opportunity arose to work at Clean Prosperity, it was kind of a full circle moment where I was finally offered the opportunity to work on the energy and climate issues that actually brought me to Ottawa in the first place.
And then so my understanding is Clean Prosperity was, active as these negotiations were going on. What was your organization actually pushing for, and maybe how does the final deal compare to, what you would have hoped to see?
Yeah, so our focus was advocacy-wise with both the Alberta government and the federal government was for an agreement, kind of a grand bargain as the language was being used, that had a robust carbon pricing regime and then included CCFDs, carbon contracts for difference. We can go into them in greater detail a little bit later in the conversation, but kind of off the top, how they're best understood is as an insurance policy that allows industry to invest in decarbonization with certainty that the carbon pricing system that they're investing on the basis of is going to be around in 5 years, 10, 15 years. So it effectively provides them the certainty that they need in order to invest the billions upon billions of dollars required for industrial decarbonization in this country.
For people that have, heard the headlines, but maybe haven't seen the actual agreement, could you maybe just briefly walk us through what's changed and like what's actually new here versus that old regime?
Yeah, so let me try and explain the regime as it were, the problems with the regime, and then the new agreement.
Perfect.
Because there's some counterfactuals that maybe we need to get into in order to fully understand what's going on here. So under the previous system, there's a piece of federal legislation called the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, sometimes abbreviated to GIPA. That is a federal law that set out two different parts. The first part was the consumer carbon tax, which has since been repealed. And the second part sets out the system for industrial emissions pricing in this country. And basically what the law says is there's a federal backstop where there's a federal industrial carbon pricing system that will apply. But provinces have the option to stand up their own systems that are comparable to the federal system. So this is what's termed the equivalency test. If provinces set up an equivalent regime, then they can control their own system. They can control the proceeds from that system. They can balance that system how they like, as long as it's kind of materially similar to the federal system along a couple of kind of guideposts. And the headline price is kind of what arches over this. And that's the price that was mirrored in the consumer price that a lot of people are familiar with. So it was the $15 a year increases in the headline price of carbon up to a maximum at that point of $170 in 2030. So the key thing to understand about the consumer price versus the industrial price is on paper, because they share that same headline price of $15 increments up to $170, they look similar, but they're actually not similar at all. The way industry pays is incredibly different, and the structure of what's called the output-based pricing systems, which are the systems that apply in all of the provinces except for Quebec. Quebec operates on a cap and trade system, means that industry actually only pays a fraction of that headline price. And I can dive into that just for a second. So you see a headline price of $170 a ton. Let's just use the 2030 number because it's easy. So if that were applied to the consumer price, every Canadian buying gas at the pump would have been paying $170 a ton, divided by how much CO2 is in a ton of gasoline, and that's the price they pay at the pump, and then they'd be rebated that afterwards. On the industrial side, that's not how it works. That's kind of a flat carbon tax with rebate model. The way it works on the industrial side is there are benchmarks set for a facility in terms of how many emissions are covered. Thinking the 20 to 40% range, depends on the facility, depends on the year, a number of different variables. So that's actually, they're only paying on a share of their emissions. And then they have different compliance options. They can pay the direct cost of $170 a ton in 2030, or they could have, but they can also use credits. And there are credits in the markets that are generated in two primary ways. By facilities exceeding benchmarks that are set for them, or overperforming benchmarks, i.e. Having reduced their emissions and polluting less than they otherwise would have, or through, and this isn't in all jurisdictions, but in many, is offset projects. So if you think about, forestry offsets are a big one in British Columbia. There's renewable offsets in Alberta. There's other categories of offsets that come from agriculture. There's ones that come from pneumatic devices at industrial sites. So there's, a whole variety. And offsets in Alberta were trading for substantially less than the headline price of carbon. So the headline price of $95 a ton, as it is this year, offsets were selling for $20 to $30. And so in these different systems, you can use, or offsets and credits, you can use credits to satisfy a significant amount of your obligation. So if you think of that, to try and make this more comprehensible from the consumer standpoint, instead of paying at the pump, you could use credits, which would be a fraction of the price of what you would have had to pay at the pump. And then you'd be paying on 20 to 30% of what you were buying at the pump. So these are the kind of two major variables that substantially reduce the cost for industry relative to kind of the consumer model. And so the consumer model isn't really comparable to the way it works in the industrial side. And the reason the industrial side kind of has these leniencies in it is about concern of carbon leakage. If you were to apply the full carbon tax to industry, that would cause a lot of issues for industry because industry, emits a lot of CO2 and it won't be competitive. And so the system has been designed to do two things: allow for industry to remain competitive over the long term, and to only apply the carbon tax on some of the emissions that industry is emitting, which means that it's really high cost to do incremental tons of CO2, but not all your tons. Does that make sense?
Can you break down that nuance there?
Yeah. So let's imagine, Justin Cement puts out 1 million tons of CO2 a year, right? I can charge you $10 a ton across all those million tons.
Mm-hmm.
And if you reduce 1 ton, you get $10. Or I can charge you $200 on your last 10%. And if you reduce a ton, you get $200. But you're not paying on all those tons. So the cost can be similar.
Yep.
Those two systems, but the value of reducing tons at the margin or emitting tons at the margin is much higher. So it becomes more expensive to pollute more valuable to pollute less, but the system cost overall is much lower.
Okay. And that also you were talking about carbon leakage, and, company wouldn't just pick up and move to another jurisdiction where there isn't carbon pricing and be able to, pollute over there freely. It kind of balances those two competing interests.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone acknowledges that, the goal of these systems is not to drive industry out of business. The goal of these systems is create, incentives that allow industry in a competitive way to reduce their emissions incrementally year over year. And that doesn't, emissions reduction is challenging because it's chunky. It doesn't happen incrementally. Sometimes companies need to save up for a few years to do a big project that reduces their emissions. And then they're in the green for a number of years and they're able to generate credits from the system that pay for it. There's a lot of things that happen under the surface that are a lot more complicated and a lot different than the machinery that people are used to with the consumer model. So that's kind of my number one flag to start talking about these things is like, if you apply the system that you were thinking about as a consumer at the pump, you're totally off track. It's a completely different system with completely different intentions and design.
Got it. And so those persistently low prices, I would imagine that's where the floor comes in as a really important piece. Could you unpack why that matters and maybe that gap between the floor and the headline price?
Yeah. So the systems are all supposed to be roughly equivalent, right?
Okay.
But all the provinces manage the systems differently. And the federal government kind of only checks in every 5 years was the system that we were working on, what was called the benchmark pricing review. And this year is actually one of those years where, the federal government is checking in with the systems to see how they go, and the systems will be redesigned and tweaked, both to comply with where the federal backstop and benchmark are, but also now to reflect what's in the Alberta agreement, and we can get into that in a moment. But what that means is the provincial governments, we don't have one industrial pricing system in Canada. We have 9 or 10, depending on how you count them. It's actually one of the weaknesses of Canada as a jurisdiction on this front is Europe has the EU ETS that spans across the European Union. So it's a supranational industrial system that spans many countries. We have, 10 subnational systems.
Yeah.
So if you're an international investor looking to invest in Canada, with an industrial facility, cement, steel, chemistry, et cetera, you have to decide which jurisdiction you want, and then you have to decide, what is the carbon pricing in that jurisdiction. And so the characteristics of the market in Canada are very different province to province, and that's kind of one of the weaknesses of our system. So what was happening in Alberta was Alberta had a lot of offsets, and it had folks banking credits, which led to an oversupply of credits and, basic supply and demand. The value of credits went down, and so the value of emissions reductions went down as well. If your plan is to generate offsets through a carbon capture, facility, you want high credit prices in order to pay off your investment. It costs a lot of money to capture and sequester carbon. It's a very energy intensive process. You need credit prices of something like $130 a ton. Well,
okay.
If the credits are incredibly variable and leaning towards oversupply, and they're only trading for $25 a ton, then your carbon capture facility is never going to make money. And the bank that is going to lend you money is going to ask you, in order to build that facility, is going to ask you, what certainty do you have that this regime of industrial pricing is going to exist in a couple of years because it's entirely contingent on government policy. And then what certainty do you have that prices are going to be in the ballpark that you're estimating on your business plan? So these are the kind of certainty challenges that arise with it. Where carbon pricing works, economists love carbon pricing because it sets the right incentives, it does lowest cost. But when there's political uncertainty and the system is changing all the time, it doesn't create a conducive environment for investment. And so the question is, how do you solve for the certainty problems that come with industrial carbon pricing? And I'll come back to that in a moment. Alberta has this oversupply. Other provinces like British Columbia, they manage their system differently. They don't have oversupply problems. They have markets that are perhaps too tight.
Okay.
So every market in Canada has different characteristics in it, and that's also one of the problems.
Right.
The markets are also different, that it's very kind of inconsistent treatment across Canada, despite the fact that they're all meeting this kind of benchmark test, this equivalency test from the federal government. That then they meet this test and then they kind of start to diverge and go in different directions. And so effectively the treatment can be very different and the experience can be very different for facilities in different provinces, which isn't really the intended effect. The one piece you've picked up on, and it's been one of kind of the notional standouts that people have been talking about from the implementation agreement between the federal government and the Alberta government, is the price floor. Essentially, it's an acknowledgement that you want to set a minimum price in order to kind of align these systems a little better, so you don't have one jurisdiction in which credits are $5 and then one in which they're $95. Like, that just doesn't make sense. It's not very fair. You set a minimum price. There are different ways to set a minimum price. And, if you think about different ways you can do it, there's supply and demand levers, right? One of the ways that economists like for setting minimum price is for the government to serve as buyer of last resort and buy up credits at a floor price. So it says, we're going to buy every credit for $50. And that way, no credit will trade below $50 because the government will buy it at $50.
Yeah. Okay.
It also creates the incentive for the government that manages the market to tweak the supply and demand levers such that it doesn't have to buy a lot of credits because the credit supply isn't in a glut.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't have to put out money. That's not what is in the agreement. What is in the agreement instead is a different option, which is a little more challenging, and we can talk about it. And it's not entirely clear exactly what all the rules are. The agreement is kind of high level.
Lots to be figured out still, and
lots to be figured out. There'll be ongoing negotiations, I would say months after this.
Mm-hmm.
But effectively what it says is we're going to do a regulatory price floor. We're just going to decree through regulation that there's going to be a price floor. The starting price is $60 in 2030. And there's different ways to do that, and we're not exactly clear at the moment how that is going to transact in real terms. There's kind of two you can imagine off the top. Just the government says, thou shalt not sell a credit below $60, which is a bit of like a price fixing-y rent control.
Sure, yeah.
It's not really the one that I think we'd prefer economists. Or there's another one that says, like, you can sell credits for below $60, but when you go to hand them into government to meet your obligations, you need to top up those credits. And that kind of has its own challenges as well.
Interesting, yeah.
Because it doesn't provide the certainty for credit sellers that they're going to get that $60.
And it also seems like a big accounting challenge too, in figuring out what equivalency that is, and
And to make it more challenging, all of this is, simple in a world in which credits are transacted directly, but credits are often rolled into other agreements like power purchase agreements in Alberta, where the renewable sector, if you have a solar farm, then you are selling your power and often the credits that come with it to the same buyer. And those, there isn't a breakout price for the credits. They're kind of lumped together. And so how do you enforce a minimum price floor when things are bundled together in, long-term contracts already? So these are kind of the questions that still need to be solved and still need to be worked out, and more clarity needs to be provided. And then the other question to layer on is what this minimum price floor looks like and whether or not this minimum price floor finds its way into the benchmark for every other province in Canada and territory in Canada to have to incorporate into their system.
Right, which is kind of it's almost like a double floor. Like you have a federal backstop plus a floor.
So,
or is the floor just in the provincial, their version of it?
Yeah, so what you have is you have the benchmark, which is the rules the federal government sets that the provincial systems must comply with. And if the provincial systems cross any of the red lines the federal government sets, then there's the backstop system that comes in, which is a federal output-based pricing system that comes in with slightly different rules. The federal government, isn't keen to impose that. It wants to encourage provinces to run their own systems. And most do, but there's a federal backstop in place in 2 provinces and one of the territories, Manitoba and Prince Edward Island, and you can imagine why. It's because they don't have a lot of industrial emissions, and they said, we're not going to bother setting up our own system. We'll happily take the federal manpower of running the system, and then we don't have to worry about it. It's not an issue for us.
For sure.
So any province can avail themselves of that, but provinces that are larger generally prefer to be in control. But the kind of policy architecture here is there's kind of this fallback, which is the federal system. And then provinces are now likely going to have to design in the headline price, which is the ceiling, and now a floor, and then they'll operate in the space between the ceiling and the floor. That's where the market transacts. We deal most with Alberta, and the reason the federal government negotiated this with Alberta is because Alberta represents a little over 50% of industrial emissions in Canada. And so Alberta is most of the game when it comes to industrial emissions, where other provinces like Ontario, sometimes when I do advocacy in Ontario, I kind of have to tell them, like, you guys actually aren't the biggest fish here. I know you're used to being the biggest fish on everything else, but Ontario is not actually going to be driving policy decisions here. All the policy decisions are coming out of Alberta, because Alberta is actually, several times larger than you in terms of the impact of these policies. So that's why the federal government goes to Alberta to negotiate this. And then the other provinces, by virtue of the Alberta agreement having to be integrated into the federal tests, means that the other provinces are going to benefit from what Alberta negotiated, i.e. the federal tests will be weakened to reflect the agreement with Alberta.
I see. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We're going to get into some of the risks and long-term implications. Would love to get your take on the impact, like what this means for investment decisions. I know there's a lot to still be figured out in this system, but maybe at a high level, what has changed? What might have changed in their calculus from this deal? Like, how does the deal kind of move the needle on some of these decisions?
Yeah, so the basic way to think about decarbonization writ large or any of these technologies, if you're a founder, you're developing a new technology, is really what is the cost per ton that my technology or my facility or my solution is going to generate in terms of emissions reduction. So if you have a technology that reduces industrial emissions at $5 a ton, great. You can make a lot of money on that in the present system. If you have a technology that reduces emissions at $200 a ton, you're going to have a harder time. And so what you can do is basically line up all the different technology options you have for reducing emissions at any given facility. And you can kind of rank them by how much it costs to reduce emissions by implementing that technology. And so you have different options. The options are fairly well known at this point. Not to say that there aren't new ones that come available, but there's things like fuel switching. There's things like carbon capture that are all talked about. And we've done research that creates what's called a marginal abatement curve, which basically, is a listing of all the different costs per ton reduction that you can get at different facilities. And some reductions happen, there's a lot of reductions that happen at $130 a ton is, kind of a notional tipping point, which is one of the reasons why $130 a ton was integrated into this agreement as the headline price in 2035. Because when you get to that, and if you're able to get credits for $130 a ton, then a lot of carbon capture becomes economically viable. So if you're a founder, you have to think realistically, what is the cost per ton? There's other technologies that are if it's first of kind, or like direct air capture is an example where the cost per ton right now is like $400.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have a pathway to $400 a ton right now. These technologies are being supported by tech firms and the like who are electing to pay $400 a ton because they're supportive of the technology and they see value in the long-term development of these technologies. But in the short term, what you want to do is you want to look at your price schedule and say, at what point on this price schedule does my technology become economically relevant, and is it going to be developed for that time? And that's when my technology can feasibly be deployed. So there's the price schedule and kind of lining up your innovation or your technology with that. And then there's, to go back to what I mentioned earlier, the certainty question, which is what looms over industrial carbon markets as a government created market. They are a function of government policy. And so they can change at any time. There are folks who made investments based on $170 a ton under the Trudeau policy that are now facing a different price schedule under Carney within a couple of years within the same political party leading at the federal level. So there is a certain amount of uncertainty to this that creates challenges for long-term investment.
Absolutely.
Because the market is uncertain. And that's where carbon contracts for difference come into it. So to think about them is as an insurance policy. Sometimes I've analogized it to, it's like crop insurance where the government controls the weather. In crop insurance, you're insuring farmers against, adverse weather events. With carbon contracts for difference, you're insuring investors against your government changing its own policies.
Right. Okay.
So the government can still change its policies, but it just has to pay out or compensate the folks who are left out by the policies that it's changing. Another, this is carbon contracts for difference makes it sound kind of unique. It's language that not a lot of people are familiar with. There's comparable policies that have operated in Canada in the past, in the electricity market in Alberta, in the electricity market in the United Kingdom. There's some in Germany. But functionally, think of it like at its most basic form, it's like a cancellation clause on any other contract. Like the national shipbuilding strategy. We have shipyards that need to retool over the course of years in order to build vessels over the course of decades. And so if we were to change that and say, no, we don't want boats anymore, would they build us any boats if the government could do that on a whim?
Yeah. Okay.
The answer is no, right?
Yeah.
And so the contracts around shipbuilding and aircraft procurement and all these things, they have cancellation clauses that say, like, listen, we are asking you as the private sector to take risk, and we're going to insure some of the downside of that risk in the event that we change our mind. And carbon contracts for difference are effectively that policy applied to the decarbonization space. To say, you want to build, the Pathways project, a $16 billion decarbonization facility, well, we are going to insure some of the downside of that risk in the event that we change our mind and change the policy. Because, $170 a ton in 2030 has suddenly become $130 a ton in 2035. And so if you invested on the basis of one, you've kind of been left out in the cold.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I saw, some writing from Clean Prosperity that, if carbon contracts or contracts for difference were done right, it would relieve a lot of this kind of policy uncertainty. And because I've heard multiple people saying, when they're evaluating an investment in primarily a startup, if there's a carbon price or like some of these policy incentives, they write them to zero and see how everything pencils out based off of that. Because we've seen it, we've seen it in the States, we've seen it in Canada. These policies can come and go, and then you're stuck. This is no longer economically viable. What does getting carbon contracts for difference right actually look like? Are there particular ways that this needs to be structured in order to achieve that mandate? Maybe, I don't know if there's other kind of comparable examples that have really, really done it well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions around design because there's a lot of different elements, moving pieces to the way a contract for difference can be structured. We have, at the federal level, there's some experience with contracts for difference and kind of more generally what are termed carbon contracts now.
Okay.
Which is an umbrella term intended to capture carbon credit offtake agreements as well through the Canada Growth Fund. The
Right.
Canada Growth Fund was set up a couple of years ago, and as part of its mandate, the federal government at the time was interested in carbon contracts for difference. And so it empowered the CGF, the Canada Growth Fund, to go out and make deals in order to progress decarbonization projects. And so there's an example of this. Entropy is a capture on a natural gas plant in Alberta. They got a carbon credit offtake, a CCO, from the Canada Growth Fund that basically has the Canada Growth Fund purchasing their credits at 86.50 plus inflation over the course of the next 15 years. So you can imagine being in Entropy's shoes saying, the only product we create through our carbon capture is carbon credits. And now we have a guaranteed buyer of those carbon credits for the next 15 years. That's awesome.
Right.
And there's kind of similar conversations happening in the critical mineral space, where if we want critical minerals investments and the market is, flooded by China, we need to create guaranteed buyers. The United States is doing this of those critical minerals in order to get the mines off the ground, because otherwise the mines just don't pencil because the price of critical minerals is too low. But if we want to build domestic capacity in some of these critical minerals, we need to provide an offtake at a fixed price in order to ensure that the economics pencil and they can go get investors and so on and so forth. So that is an example of a carbon contract. And for all intents and purposes, we can kind of lump the offtake agreement and the CCFD together here as policies that effectively operate the same. But the difference is, in that case, the Canada Growth Fund went to Entropy and negotiated what we call a bespoke CCFD with Entropy based on the economics of their individual project. What we would like to see instead is a model of carbon contracts for difference where the federal government says, this is the headline or the strike price that we're offering these contracts at, which is the price at which is effectively the floor price of the contract, the price that we're going to guarantee industry is going to get, which would be above the minimum transfer price set in the Alberta federal agreement. And then, come and get them, like first come, first served basis. Like there is no mystery as to whether or not you'll get one. We're not going to do the government black box where everyone comes into a room and negotiates and then some are handed out after the fact. It's just this is available like CMHC home insurance. You don't really question whether or not you're going to get it. Mm-hmm. You just go to the bank, you meet the threshold, and then you get it, within a certain level of reason. But then you can have industry go and say, okay, this is on the books. We are eligible for it or we're not. Our project economics either align with that or they don't. And then we can decide whether or not we want to advance the project on that basis. So the goal is to take the unpredictability out of the equation and just add a lot more certainty across the board. That's kind of our number one word to keep emphasizing with all of these programs. It's about providing certainty. There's other ways to do it, like the bespoke. The government goes out and meets the top candidates, negotiates with them, and sees who it can find. That doesn't provide a lot of certainty. If you at Justin Cement are thinking about your decarbonization, you want to do like a FEED study, front-end engineering and design, you're not sure if the costs of abatement are going to be competitive with what the government is offering. So maybe you don't do it. Maybe you don't take that risk because you're worried about getting, to the front of the line or negotiating, or any of these other pieces that make dealing with the government uncertain at times.
For sure. Yeah. Hinging an investment decision on the potential outcome of a negotiation is pretty wild. And then on this kind of like risk uncertainty topic, one of the tensions, I guess, that I keep coming back to is like a big part of the case for this deal was like clarity, stability, but also like making a deal shows that the terms can be renegotiated. Like this is, to my knowledge, the first, major change to the system since it's been implemented at the federal level. Carbon contracts, I think, make a lot of sense in terms of it's a commercial contract that's fairly stable. But does the simple fact of a deal being made undermine the long-term credibility of this framework? Or was this like, this is a necessary intervention for something that was not even achieving its goals in the first place?
Yeah, so I'd say the latter. The irony of being, an advocate for certainty in these systems while advocating for change in these
Yeah.
is it's certainly not lost on me. But it's justified in this case when the system isn't working. The system isn't achieving its intended goals. The counterfactual that I think is lost when folks are looking at this, um, from the environmental lens as well as others, is the headline price schedule went from $170 a ton in 2030 to $115 a ton in 2030. So on the face of it, that looks like a substantial weakening to the system. And it is a substantial weakening of the system if you live in a world in which you thought the $170 a ton was going to happen. I don't think, now it's a counterfactual world. The way the systems were working and operating and everything was trending wasn't in the right direction. And we don't, I didn't believe that we were going to get to $170 a ton and that these systems were going to function well at $170 a ton. So there's a bit of a reset that's happened here. And our hope is that, now the systems are going to go through a period of change. There are going to be some changes that need to be made in the other provinces in order to align with this kind of new set of rules. But then once, the CCFDs are in place and so on and so forth, then we can just let these systems run. Because that is the end state we want to get to, is like a system that everyone agrees on.
Yeah.
And then we can just walk away from it and not talk about it anymore. That's, everyone can just make their investment decisions based on a stable policy regime, stable and uncontroversial policy regime.
Yeah.
That functions well. In reality, that's a smidge optimistic, which is why we need things like CCFDs that provide that certainty on top. But that's kind of the dream. The end state is to get to a system that is well designed, increases, tightens a little bit over time, and that gives industry predictability, both on the decarbonization side, which is where we spent the bulk of the time talking, but also from the cost side, right?
Yeah.
The facilities that are going, we can't paper over the fact that these systems implicate costs for some facilities. We want those costs to be manageable and predictable. And if you do that, then a lot of industry is actually pretty happy with these systems because they acknowledge that, they pollute, they emit CO2, they're aware of the problem. They have shareholders, they have ESG, they have all these other things. And so they are happy to live with one of these systems and to work and to comply with these systems, so long as the rules aren't changing on them every 5 5 years, whatever it is. Because of course, that's really all anyone can ask for when dealing with government is please don't constantly be changing the rules.
Yeah. And you mentioned at the 170, it maybe wasn't feasible or workable. Because I guess there's another argument where, okay, could we keep the 170 and really target the oversupply and those persistently low prices to actually bring that closer but stay on the same trajectory? Do you think that would have been a feasible path, or was there something more untenable about that 170?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of ways to think about it. Yes, there was an oversupply, so could you just correct the architecture of the market in Alberta and continue driving towards 170? There are certainly people who will tell you that. One of the other elements of it that should be underappreciated is the political dynamic of it, right? Is you need buy-in from, or to operate these systems long-term and consistently, you need buy-in from industry and buy-in from provinces. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have political friction on this, which results in that kind of whipsawing back and forth in policy. And so the more political tension there is on the file, because the less disagreement there is around the trajectory, the more likely you're going to get that political whipsaw over the long term, right?
Yeah, okay.
The political life of government is every 4 years. I use Ontario sometimes as a case study, where if you look at Ontario over the last, I think it's 8 years, Ontario went from no system to a cap and trade system, to no system, to the federal system, to the Ontario EPS system. And then in the most recent election, Doug Ford is presently in government. Bonnie Crombie, in her platform, said, we're going to get rid of Doug Ford's carbon pricing system and put in a new system.
Right, okay.
So, that's totally untenable. And that's in one jurisdiction, of which we have 10 plus. So, you need political buy-in at both the federal and provincial level. The federal government is well established in terms of like this one, the GGPPA, the legislation I mentioned at the start, went to the Supreme Court in a reference. The federal government, by all is in the clear for legislating in this space, but that doesn't dissolve political realities of the frictions that can happen in our federation if a major province where 50% of industrial emissions is always chafing against the policy. That doesn't create long-term certainty, even if the federal government has, absolute authority over the space. So that's why an agreement like this with Alberta has tremendous potential of settling the question over the long term, and actually industry can look at the political reality of it and say, okay, there is, political consensus between the Alberta government and the federal government as to what this looks like across party lines.
Yeah,
there is agreement, and that bodes well for the longevity of these systems.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And then in a similar vein, carbon pricing has always raised this federal provincial issue. Premier Eby in BC doesn't sound very happy that this deal was done with Alberta alone. I think that the Ontario case that you just laid out shows, everyone doing their own thing, changing repeatedly is maybe not the best model. What are some of the implications that this has for maybe like BC, Ontario, Quebec? Maybe not as much with their cap and trade system, but does this become a race to the bottom, a ceiling on what's possible? Yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, so effectively what it means, like big picture, what happened here is the federal government has set new rules that are weaker than the old rules, but have better structure behind them, if we can term it as that. So you're trading structure and certainty for rules that on paper looked stronger. What that means is that for the provinces that were in compliance with the original set of rules, they are going to be having stronger systems that reduce more emissions, have a higher price than Alberta will have in the short term. And so they're going to be faced with the decision as to whether or not they want to maintain their system as is, or weaken their system to kind of the deal that Alberta got. But the deal that Alberta got should be seen as the floor, because the federal power in this space is to set a national minimum across the entire country. That's not the minimum as in the minimum transfer price, but it's kind of the minimum market framework for pricing carbon writ large. That's right. That's the equivalency test in the backstop. That's what the Supreme Court allowed the federal government to do. So they've said, okay, we're lowering that floor to the deal that we made with Alberta, and this is the new criteria. Everyone else has always had the option of exceeding that floor or matching it and seeing, what alignment with that floor looks like. In reality, what I would expect is most provinces will amend their system to be in alignment with Alberta, and so, or in alignment with the rules that Alberta got effectively. So the headline price in all the provinces in most provinces will probably decrease from that 170 in 2030 to 115 in 2030. I would expect British Columbia may make that move as well. Sure that, they're on par with their provincial neighbor.
Okay, that's really helpful to get a lay of the land, and seeing provinces have the room to exceed and kind of be more ambitious, but this is the new level playing ground across the country. One of the last questions I had for you was maybe if we just like zoom out. So, and this kind of came from seeing Guilbeault resign as environment minister and then leave the party. If we zoom out, like broadly, what's your outlook on climate policy right now? Because there's a huge amount of economic pressure driven by the trade war with the United States, a drive to remain globally competitive. For some, that means building pipelines. And we see EU and China heading in a very different direction. And we've had some of these grand bargains before. We've had Trans Mountain, carbon pricing itself. If you're looking ahead at maybe the next 5 to 10 years, where do we go from here, and how, maybe some thoughts on how do we keep making progress and not backsliding when, the economic kind of challenges arise?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There is no doubt, this is reflected in public polling, and that climate is a lower priority on people's agendas right now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, et cetera. But just because it's lower priority doesn't mean it's gone.
Right.
All of these issues ebb and flow with, economics and geopolitics and everything else going on in the world. Obviously, things like the Iran war are top of mind, and energy security. And so what's important from the climate perspective is being able to weather these storms of public interest, of government policy, and having policy that is durable over the long term to just kind of continue plucking away at the problem. Because a lot of these problems are dealt with through consistent incremental action rather than fits and starts and policy whipsaw. It's often said that if we had carbon pricing like 30 years ago, a lot of our problems would be solved by now.
Right.
And what happens in a lot of jurisdictions is you have carbon pricing and then no carbon pricing and then carbon pricing again and then no carbon pricing. And what you want really is consistent policy across all these spaces that just continues to pluck away at the problem. And then it can be more ambitious when, there's political appetite and the political cycle is willing to be more ambitious. And it's okay for it to fade into the background a little bit when there are other more pressing concerns. It's important, I think, for climate advocates not to be tone deaf of the times and to kind of spend their political will or to try and spend their political goodwill at the wrong moments when the government is dealing with crises that take other forms. There's kind of the poly crisis people talk about, where whether or not climate is at the top of that list will ebb and flow. Right now, as I was saying, we're in an environment which is really challenging for climate, which is why I think there's reason to be optimistic about locking in a headline or a carbon price schedule with Alberta that runs until the 2035s, 2040s.
Sure, yeah.
At a time when geopolitics is so challenging. So to get, essentially the most conservative government in Alberta to an agreement where it is supportive of carbon pricing, in the broader context of what's going on is, a tremendous accomplishment, because the alternatives are not necessarily only a $170 price in 2030. It could be a $0 price in 2030. For
sure. Yeah.
So sometimes the middle ground here is still a success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, seeing what happened to the consumer carbon pricing is almost like a cautionary tale. Like, if you're not responsive and not listening, that can be the outcome versus, okay, how do we adapt to this new political reality? And I think your point about climate advocates being, sensitive to kind of the broader realities and not only climate as the single issue, I think is really well taken. And personally, I would like to see climate being tied into economic issues far more. Like, I was excited for, climate competitiveness as a theory that maybe hasn't really panned out fully, but there's a lot, I think, there to talk about in terms of how climate and the economy can work really well together, that I think we could be beating that drum a lot harder.
Yeah, and I think that is having a moment right now. Concepts like the energy wallet and electrotech and like trying to emphasize the consumer affordability element of, the technologies that are available to consumers that both reduce emissions and lower costs. And I think that will continue to be kind of the cutting edge for some of the deployment opportunities for climate technologies at the consumer level, kind of the medium to long term.
Perfect. Etienne, I think this is a great note to leave it. Thanks so much for spending some time with us. Anywhere that people should go to find you or follow Clean Prosperity's work? Yeah, I am not much on the social media. So I would just encourage folks, if they're interested, to check out some of the reports that are on our website. And I believe it's cleanprosperity.ca. Perfect. Okay, we'll link to some of those. Thanks again for spending some time. Really appreciate it. Likewise. Thank you for having me, Justin.